here. This is a great turnout and a really good indication that I won't be alone in Parliament for long. Jefferson so much for being a great candidate and bringing the Green Party banner into Nanaimo-Alberni. I know we're going to have new boundaries and it's going to make a difference and we're going to have to figure out, and for those of you who we are losing here, we'll welcome you to the next one. But there really is no question, if you haven't noticed, with the election of Andrew Weaver to the British Columbia legislature and me representing Saanich-Gulf Islands, that Vancouver Island is ground zero for the Green Party building and growing and being a full caucus in Parliament at the end of the term. I'm in the midst of something I do in my riding twice a year, which is town hall meetings in 8 locations, and we decided for January we're going to do 9. I hold meetings on each of the Gulf Islands that I represent, and 4 locations on the Saanich Peninsula. And these are very nonpartisan. I'm there because the green theory of politics and democracy, well, it's a stunning theory of democracy, is that the member of Parliament represents the people from that riding. Right? Whoa! Not taking orders from the leader. Now, the reason it's so essential that there be more Green members of Parliament is that the media, the rest of Canada, and certainly the other MPs, don't really believe me when I tell them that when there are more Green MPs, we won't be whipping votes. And the only way for me to prove it is to have more Green MPs, so that when they vote in different ways from the way I would wish they would, and it's still all part of Green values and grassroots democracy, and I don't look upset about it. I mean, I just can't wait to have it, a large and unruly caucus. I mean, well, because that is part of our values. One of our core Green global values is grassroots democracy. And how can you have grassroots democracy, or any democracy, when every member of Parliament is told how to vote, not just on some of the votes, but on all of the votes? That was a big surprise for me after I got elected 2 years ago. I know how Parliament works pretty well. I used to work in government, but the level of party discipline has become much, much worse since I last worked closely with Parliament. So that on every single vote, you see these lovely young people who are university students who work as pages for the House of Commons. And they go around, there's a half an hour when bells ring before a vote. So the House is in session and the pages walk around furtively with their stack of sheets that they've received from each of the party whips. So the Conservative Party whip has handed these pages their instructions, and the NDP Party whip has handed out their instructions, the Liberal Party whip has handed out their instructions, and even the poor benighted Bloc Québécois, which is down for a while to 4 MPs and now has 5, they have their instructions. And on every desk, on every vote, the pages, sometimes they're nervous because there's a dividing line where one set of desks are NDP and one set of desks are Liberal, and then they check to make sure that the names are right as they put down the instructions that on this bill, you're voting no. On this bill, you're voting yes. On this bill, we're voting. Every single desk. And once when I was taking my seat in the Commons, and I have a great spot, by the way. I haven't seen you all for a while. I haven't told you about my desk. I don't suppose I've told you about my desk. I have a great spot. It's kind of in the back of Beyond in Parliament. It's the far, far, far corner. It means that I've got a panoramic view of everybody else because I'm in the far corner. My chair doesn't go all the way back because it bumps into the translation booth. Some of you may know this because there'll be 30 more next time around, but right now there are 308 members of Parliament. So just for fun, I like this as a pop quiz. Can anyone guess my desk number? 309. It's sort of like a lucky ticket. I love my desk. And when Bruce Heyer left the NDP because he was sick of being punished for voting the way he did on the gun registry, and they said to him, you're going to have seat 309, and I emailed him and I said, great, they're moving me to 308, we'll be sitting next to each other. He said, I can't sit in that chair, it's not possible to get into the desk because of the translator booth. And So I wrote the House to the Speaker's office and said, I'll keep 309, give Mr. Heyer 308, because I'm fine where I am. So from where I am at my little desk, and they were handing out all the instruction sheets for how to vote, and right in front of me are the Liberals, and to the right of me are the Bloc Québécois, and a little bit farther over are my friends in the NDP. So one of the Liberals looked up at me as he was reading his instruction sheet. He said, gee, Elizabeth, how do you know how to vote? They're all so sad about it. They're really, the other thing that was a shocker for me when I got elected was realizing that nobody reads the bills. I'm the only member of Parliament, I'm quite sure of this, I'm the only member of Parliament who reads all the bills. And I'm one of the few who reads any of them. I really don't think you should applaud for someone doing their job at a minimum level. We're passing legislation, and I'm not kidding you. They don't, but then when you think about it, if you know you're only going to be allowed to vote a certain way, do you really want to read the bill and realize you might disagree with the decision the party has prescribed for you and you're going to have to vote a certain way? So more Green MPs, I see, is the only way to revive democracy in Canada. We can change parties and who's Prime Minister, and it is really important that Stephen Harper be gone way before the next election. Every single day that he is in the Langevin block in the Prime Minister's office, every single day, he does something more to destroy Canada. And he does more to destroy Canada, I think, than even other people within his own party would if they took his place, if he was driven out of office, resigned or whatever, and left before the next election. So that is critical. So I don't mean to suggest for a minute that sort of all the other parties are more or less the same. That's completely wrong, and there are some very, very good policies in the NDP, and there's some good policies in the Liberals. Actually, some policies in the Conservatives aren't that bad either, if you actually sat down and we were able to work on them together. But what we have right now, because of this hyper-partisanship, is that they're constantly all attacking each other, which is another reason that I guess I'm sort of bit by bit sharing what I would call a prescription for rescuing democracy from politics, right? Because what is threatening democracy right now in Canada, and democracy is in trouble in Canada. It's on life support, and there's people reaching for the plugs, right? It's in real trouble. One of the main culprits for the pathetic state of our democracy is the rise in the power of well-organized political parties that have put a stranglehold on basic Westminster parliamentary democracy and the basic idea that members of Parliament represent their constituents. Good, basic foundation. The other thing that is really a threat in all of this is our voting system. The first-past-the-post system that communicates to voters, your vote may not count, it doesn't really matter, and that's another aspect that when you feed into first-past-the-post, the role of well-organized political parties, this is where you get the craziness that says, well, they'll get more seats. I mean, this was, not to be too rough on the NDP, but in 2000, I mean, this is why I left Sierra Club of Canada to become leader of the Green Party, was watching, like a slow-motion train wreck, people whom I not only respected but loved, deciding that it was going to be a good idea to have the NDP join with the Conservatives to gang up on the Liberals because that was a genius strategy for getting the NDP more seats. Even if it meant Conservatives, even if it meant Stephen Harper becoming Prime Minister, that was a deliberate strategy. It wasn't an accident. The only thing that makes rational people do that kind of crazy thing is because the first-past-the-post system will punish a political leader who does what I like to do and acknowledge that, hey, Stéphane Dion would be a good Prime Minister, or Tom Mulcair would be a good Prime Minister, or Justin Trudeau. They'd be, as long as there's enough Greens in there to keep them honest, we could work them out, right? If you acknowledge that for a minute in the first-past-the-post system, the fear is that your base won't be as hostile towards all the others, that you'll lose votes come election time. And it means that the absolutely part of the DNA of the first-past-the-post system is that leaders of political it evades sense, right? You have to be constantly saying, we're the only ones who have good ideas. All the others are awful. Now, why do Canadians get more and more turned off politics? Because most people, hearing a politician say that, know for sure that it's nonsense. One party can't be always right and the only one to listen to. And that's so getting rid of first past the post is a very important aspect of rescuing democracy, because what it will do is increase voter turnout, because people will know that every vote counts, and it will allow us to cooperate. Now, we're still the only party that continues to push for cooperation, and we will, through the next election. But it's also critical that we identify the damage that Stephen Harper has done in destroying the architecture of Westminster parliamentary democracy, so that the next person to occupy the Prime Minister's office will be forced by the Canadian public to repair the damage. Now, a lot of you may be thinking, well, why wouldn't they repair the damage? Of course they would. Mulcair or Justin Trudeau, they'll see the damage Harper has done. But the reality of it is, there's no question about it, the next Prime Minister of Canada after Stephen Harper is very unlikely to walk into Langenham Block and say to himself, I'd like to say or herself, but if it was me, I know the damage. So anyway, very unlikely to say to himself, oh dear, I have far too much power. Look at the terrible thing Stephen Harper has done in leaving behind a system in which the Prime Minister runs everything, has permission to bully bureaucrats, to muzzle scientists, to make decisions without reconvening Parliament, to announce that we support whatever Barack Obama does. We're not really sure when it's going to happen or what it is, but we're quite sure Canada supports it. We don't need to reconvene Parliament to discuss it. The essence of parliamentary democracy, this is Westminster Parliamentary Democracy 101, is the Parliament is supreme. The Prime Minister reports to Parliament. Parliament is the government of Canada. It is never the Harper government. It is the Harper administration. It is a Harper executive. It's a Harper cabinet. But the power that has been building up, and it's not something Stephen Harper started, but he has taken it into warp drive, the power of the Prime Minister's office, which is entirely peopled with partisan hacks. They are not civil servants. The Prime Minister's office is now at $10 million a year budget, and it exists to make sure that the Conservative Party gains re-election. And at the end of another election, if it's an NDP or a Liberal government, there will be a bunch of partisan hacks for those parties that exist on tax dollars solely to be able to make sure their team gets in again next time. And they are the essence of Westminster parliamentary democracy is being dismembered. Democracy is being stolen in plain sight because our national media doesn't talk about any of this. I mean, much of what Stephen Harper has done is unconstitutional. But the problem is that in Canada, because we have a system that we've inherited from Great Britain, we have a system in which things are unconstitutional but not illegal. And it's almost as if Stephen Harper thought, oh, nice little country here. Amazing how easy it's going to be to steal power, because there are no checks and balances. The only thing in Canada that stops the Prime Minister from becoming an elected dictator is their own sense of what's appropriate, what is our tradition, their own ability to exercise self-restraint in relation to power. So if you have somebody ruthless, and, with all I try to be fair about this, but I don't see any sign of much ruth in Stephen Harper. I would say he is, in fact, ruthless. So he's figured out how to actually take our nice, wonderful country and turn us inside out and tell us that we're something else altogether. He tells us we're a warrior nation. He tells us that we don't care about the environment, that the only thing that matters is developing the oil sands and shipping bitumen to any country that will take it and process it there. He tells us that it doesn't matter to have international development assistance or poverty alleviation. He's eliminated CETA, folded it into foreign affairs, and made sure it's about Canada's business development in the guise of third world aid. He's taken our criminal justice system, which used to be founded on principles of progressive, people in prison should be able to find new skills, have prison farms. He shut down all the prison farms. And in doing so, did a message that is doubly insulting. Said to prisoners, it doesn't do you any good to learn how to grow things, even though a lot of the prison population was giving testament to the fact that the thing that turned their lives around was realizing they could do some good work and grow things. But they also said, what good is it to have prisoners growing food? Farming isn't a viable occupation for them when they leave prison. So, sold off the prison farms and have changed our prison system from one that was relatively enlightened and looking for giving people, pay your debt to society, but we don't want to see you back here again. And now it's a very, it's this tough on crime agenda, which actually is stupid on crime. There's no empirical evidence whatsoever that mandatory minimum sentences work. Entirely to the contrary, we know that mandatory minimum sentences don't work. But every bill that we've seen in the criminal justice field in Parliament since I've been elected has been about making it tougher, putting people in jail for longer, depriving judges of the ability to say, I want to use some discretion here, I want to recognize that this person really would have a better, this is one offense, first offense, I'm not going to put someone with 6 pot plants away in jail, or the latest one, I think it's a 20-year mandatory minimum if you're, is it 20 years or 10 years? I should remember these things before I tell you. It's a lot of jail time if you happen to be wearing a mask in a riot. That's a mandatory minimum sentence. There's also a mandatory minimum for defacing war monuments, but that's a much lighter sentence. That's a couple months. But this business of mandatory minimums, this is not the Canada's criminal justice tradition. So I'm just giving some examples because I know, I'm guessing that given who I see before me, you probably are aware of the fact that Stephen Harper has repealed the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, gutted the Fisheries Act, destroyed the Navajo Waters Protection Act. But the transformational changes that he's delivered to the environmental area of legislation has been matched by destructive activities and changes of laws in criminal justice, in immigration and refugee law, in a number of areas of evidence-based decision-making. He's systematically getting rid of the evidence, any evidence. He's getting, so that when you come to decision-making, it can be purely ideological. And the only kind of science they want to fund, you probably saw the press conference that Andrew Weaver and I did this week, based on a huge amount of material that was leaked to us, that in 2013-2014, Canadians spent $78 million on a series of projects that were exclusively of benefit to Enbridge. The internal government documents and the spreadsheets for this combined project that involves Fisheries and Oceans, Environment Canada, the Coast Guard, the Meteorological Service, it's called the Northern Gateway Project. So it isn't much of a leap for us to imagine it's actually about the Northern Gateway Project, right? And yet, he's got the media so enthralled that they were prepared to agree with Joe Oliver that somehow Andrew and I should have known this was all announced before. As if we missed the press conference in March, which I covered very closely. I've now put it back on our website, an article that I had published in April, analyzing that press conference, what was announced, how little was actually announced, and nowhere in there was there any announcement that we were spending $78 million this year. It did mention as an aside that there would be research into bitumen and diluent and how they behave in the environment. But the information wasn't shared with Canadians. That this was a gold-plated research project with $78 million, also to begin to establish the infrastructures for weather forecasting for supertankers full of bitumen and diluent as they enter the Hecate Strait. But this is what they're doing. So behind, in some ways in plain sight, Stephen Harper is transforming us. And he's done it at the same time that he has been systematically cutting away at the role of the courts. If a court judgment comes down he doesn't like, he ignores the court ruling. That's astonishing. Ignoring royal commissions. Mr. Justice Cohen's report on salmon. The Cohen Commission report came down, and convention dictates that within 3 months there is an official response from the Minister of Fisheries. Have you noticed The Code Commissioner Board has had no response whatsoever. So the requirement, the recommendation, aquaculture, salmon farms for migrational routes for salmon have been ignored. There's no response. And normally, well, I say normally, in previous times in Canada and in recent memory, media wouldn't have let that happen. And opposition parties would have stood up and said, where's the response to the Code Commission? And the Minister of Fisheries would have been on the ropes. But it's almost as if we're operating in a world of collective amnesia, where the way things are supposed to work and the way they used to work has been surrendered voluntarily in the brave new world of Stephen Harper as King Stephen, the first of Canada. And all of us, his loyal subjects, should just be quiet about it. And his loyal subjects happen to be, I'm afraid there's an awful lot in the media who are actually either afraid of saying things or just hoping if they keep their heads down, they'll still have their jobs when he leaves. Democracy is being stolen from us in plain sight. And that's why I'm hoping so very much that the movement of Greens can rescue democracy from politics. It's really, we have a lot of issues and we can name them. I mean, the biggest one that we have to address is the climate crisis. And we ought to be addressing local food and food security and protecting our wild salmon and making sure our kids have a decent education and protecting, it's another place where Stephen Harper's done a very tricky thing, is in our healthcare area. Field, where we're not going to revive the health accord. He's just written a check and said, that's it, we're walking away. Very clever. But the Canadian Health Act requires the federal government not walk away. And the role that we have as a party, and I'm not really all that partisan, but I don't see anybody else standing up. And if this was a war where democracy was being taken from us by a hostile foreign force, I think a lot of people would be standing up. But because it's not clear, because the battle lines, and forgive me for using military metaphors because I'm a peace activist, but the lines are drawn. But the lines are blurry, and nobody's focusing on it. And when we can elect more Greens, the by-elections are coming up this fall. We are, as you probably know, because you're probably on Green Party mailing list, you know that my deputy leader, Georges Larac, is running in Bourassa. He's got a good chance. We got to make that happen. The more Greens we elect, and the sooner we elect them, we'll be able to lead the way and show other parties and liberate other members of Parliament. The members of Parliament that I work with, this is a good part of it. I mean, I know some of you have said to me since I came in that it must be really hard, my job must be hard. It would be hard if I didn't like my friends at work. And I generally describe when my daughter comes to Parliament with me, and I grab her and take her around. She's now 22. But I grab her and take her, I want you to meet another one of my friends at work. And quite often, my friends at work can be conservatives, they can be liberals, they can be New Democrats, they can be Bloc, they can be independents. Because I think it's really critical that we treat each other with respect. And when you do that, you find, which is great, that there's some very lovely people in all those parties. And they are so... They would love to be able to represent their constituents, read the bills, cast their vote the way they think they should vote and not the way they're told to vote. They know they could be much more effective as parliamentarians if they weren't so tightly controlled. So it's not so much that I want to defeat them all as liberate them. And the only way to liberate them is to get enough Greens in there that the servitude of their situation becomes less tolerable to them. And I'm really encouraged by the fact that Brent Rathgaber is a conservative from Edmonton who quit the Conservative caucus just before we broke for the summer. I'm encouraged by the fact that Hugh Segal, who's a progressive Conservative senator some time back, led a bit of a Conservative revolt in the Senate. Now, I know most people think the Senate is revolting, but in this particular example, the thing that makes the Senate so appalling these days is that Stephen Harper's been able to exert the same kind of control over the Conservative senators as he has over Conservative MPs. That's unusual. And he was able to tell Conservative senators that he wanted them to kill the climate bill that Bruce Heyer brought forward when he was an NDP before the 2011 election. That bill passed, and it went to the Senate, and for the first time in Canadian history, a bill passed by the democratically elected House of Commons was killed by the Canadian Senate before it even got to committee. They saw their opening on a slight misstep by the Liberal Senator Grant Mitchell, who was bringing it forward. He was not calling for a vote. But it turned out Stephen Harper had told those Conservative senators, first chance you get, defeat the climate change bill. That's so anti-democratic. It's so extraordinary. That's why I've shifted my position. And honestly, I'm sorry, because the Green Party position is calling for an elected Senate. But I've actually shifted. I think we have to abolish the Senate, no matter what it takes. But it's good that you agree. So, with the ray of hope of seeing Hugh Segal buck Mr. Harper's iron will, and a bunch of other senators too of the Conservative Party, and refuse to pass a very punitive, nasty, anti-trade union piece of legislation. And that's another piece of the transformative change Stephen Harper is bringing to Canada, is a consistent, systematic assault on collective bargaining rights, on trade unions, and so on. The fact that he couldn't get that bill through, I think Stephen Harper is beginning to experience a lot of trouble controlling his caucus. It's not so apparent because the media doesn't cover it, but I'm encouraged by it, and I keep working on those backbenchers in the Conservative Party because they're the best hope we have for getting rid of Stephen Harper before the next election. And I don't want to see him here as Prime Minister. I mean, it's not that I don't, you know, I wish him well once he leaves politics. I like to think it's a generous and kind impulse, because he's obviously the kind of person who shouldn't have power. It's dangerous for him to have power, and it's not at all good for him if he's going to grow as a human being. That's kind of what I wanted to say. I'm excited about our chances as a party in the next election. I think this riding in particular, and Vancouver Island in general, and then British Columbia, but also Alberta, and also Ontario and Quebec, and also, we will have strong candidates. And we will have people that their constituents would like to see as their members of Parliament. And if we can keep up the momentum and in a well-organized riding like this, Electoral District Association, with the kind of leadership that we've had from so many long-term Greens who are in this room right now, we have the potential in this riding for you to send to Ottawa another Green Party member of Parliament. So I'll stop there and just say I'm so grateful to you. Please donate to the party, please help the local riding association, and when the time comes, please be prepared to decide it really matters to knock on doors, to talk to your friends and neighbors, to spread the word, and to make sure that this beautiful corner of Vancouver Island is represented by a Green Party member of Parliament. Thank you.